Unless you want the joke recorded. For our recent entry, what did one circle say to the other circle when they were breaking up? That's it. I've had it. I'm done.
We're oval.
Oh, yeah. It's oval between us. So, old world background. We did New World last week, except for one last slide. So I have inserted that into this one, and I'm going to talk just for a moment about the New World, and then we for real, are going to float across the Atlantic Ocean and take a look at what was happening in the so-called Old World before we bring Columbus into the Caribbean next week. You guys, I'm wandering out of the camera. This new circular capture zone is a little bit tricky. You guys thought about this problem at the end of last class. How would life have been different once farming was possible, once agriculture came along? And most of you, a large number of you, made that top point that you wouldn't have to wander around anymore. Hunter-gatherers had to hunt, follow the game animals, find things naturally, wander about. Once you started farming, you could settle down. So the official term, the fancy term for that is a conversion to sedentism, staying in one place all year long. And that changed human society in a number of ways. A number of you guys also pointed out that you could support more people. You'd have a more reliable supply of food. And that was also an essential development. I made the point that in the old hunter-gatherer days, a group our size, at that time we had about 40 people in the classroom, was the standard hunter-gatherer population. It's hard to support more than 40 people in a hunter-gatherer band. But once you have corn and potatoes and all of that stuff reliably being harvested every year, you can have not only hundreds or thousands of people, but hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And the politics of those societies became more complicated. In a small band of hunter-gatherers of maybe 40 people, the politics is very personal. You know, you have one loud person perhaps, or one very influential person, a powerful hunter who controls the opinions of other people. But in a society of 1 million or more people, you have bureaucracies, you have leaders, appointed offices, So the first civilizations. And when you get to knowledge check, if you choose to do the knowledge checks, you'll see that's the basic equation. Farming, agriculture made civilizations possible. Larger populations and more complex human societies. So the first civilizations began to develop around 3,000 or shortly after 3,000 years ago in Central America, with the most famous being the Olmec. One of the first and one of the most famous, the Olmec civilization of Central America, followed by the Mayan civilization. And one other point, you don't see it on the slide here, but it's going to become distressingly obvious next week, once we bring the new and the old world together in the Caribbean. If you remember the old world agricultural revolution, I bragged about it, inventing all of the things that you need for a good whiskey: wheat, barley, and rye. That old world agricultural revolution in the Fertile Crescent took place 10,000 years ago. This one in Central America took place 3,000 years ago. There are some consequences to that as well in terms of viruses. You guys are young enough to remember COVID. A virus just has no Nothing to work with a hunter-gatherer band of 40 people. A virus, in a wandering group of 40 people, if a virus infects somebody, it makes its way through that population of 40 people, and then it's done for. There's no place else to go. But once you've got farming, once people are living in one place in densely populated cities or communities or towns, that's when you see viruses begin to become a really significant part of human history, epidemics. And Europe had 7,000 years more development time. The Old World agricultural revolution was 10,000 years ago, and the Americas 3,000 years ago. So it's a coincidence, it's a small amount of time in the vast sweep of human history, but it means that Europeans had 7,000 years more time to develop epidemic disease, things that depended on a dense population. That shaped the history of the early contact era. Okay, now we're going to float across the Atlantic Ocean. Laser pointer, activate. Here's Central America. That's where we've just been talking about the agricultural revolution there. Now we're going to float across the Atlantic Ocean and talk about the Old World a little bit, by which is meant everything that was known to inhabitants of the Old World prior to 1492, Columbus's voyage. Of course, nobody in Europe or Africa or Asia knew very much about or anything about the Americas at that time. But Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, all of that is the Old World. So generally speaking, and I'm going to present you with a fair amount of information, but there's one simple question that we're considering today, and that is, why Europe? Why was it Europe that explored and colonized? We all know it was Europe, but if you were to go back in time and take a look at the Old World around 1000 AD, Europe would not have been your choice for a few reasons. I think you've encountered this term before. Medieval Europe was just not interested in exploration and discovery and colonization during the medieval period. This is the time frame from about the collapse of the old Roman Empire in the 5th century AD to the start of the Renaissance in the 1300s, late 1300s, the medieval era. People used to call it the Dark Ages. But Europe was involved in an economic social system called feudalism. I know you've encountered it before, and I won't waste your time talking too much about it, except to briefly re-emphasize, I think, what you probably already know. It's a land-based system in which the king basically owns everything. He gives his aristocrats, the knightly class, their own estates, their own land. And as a result of that, they're loyal to the king. Then the knightly class, the lords, the barons, the aristocrats, allow the peasants, the serfs, to work on their land, to farm it. And in exchange for being allowed to farm on that aristocrat's land, they owe him military service. When he says it's time to fight, they have to lay down their agricultural tools and pick up swords and bows and arrows and do what the aristocrat says to do. So it's a self-enclosed system. Those feudal kingdoms had everything they needed within their own boundaries. They made their own food. Their loyalties were determined based on that land within that kingdom. They did not need external trade and did not pursue external trade relations very much. The image you see there, this is part of my never-ending attempt to provide you with exciting imagery in History 111. If you've ever heard the old nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down, that's London Bridge, one of the wonders of the medieval world. It was a bridge across the Thames River in London on which Londoners had built houses and buildings, markets. It was almost a city, in itself. There were people who never left the bridge, London Bridge. And true enough, by Shakespeare's day, the 1600s, it was in disrepair and it was beginning to tumble down, fall down. It no longer exists. There was one area in which Europeans stepped outside of their comfort zone, so to speak, outside of the feudal system of Europe, and that was religion. And it's the first step bringing us towards the transformation of Europe from a region that could have cared less about exploration to the primary exploration, to the region of primary explorers. The Roman Catholic Church. Back then, it was the only church in Europe. Until you get too far, if you go farther to the east, you get the Eastern Orthodox Church. But all of Europe was under the Roman Catholic Church. Today, if you drive from Miss Ann's Fried Chicken on Main Street up to Montague Avenue Extension, you pass by Baptist churches and Lutheran churches and Methodist churches and Anglican churches, Presbyterian churches, a little bit farther up the road, and Catholic churches. But back in this day and era, there was the one unified Roman Catholic Church. And one of the ways to show God that you really cared, of course, one way was to be a good person, but you could also, especially if you'd done something bad and you needed to make up for it, you could go on a pilgrimage to one of the sacred sites of Christianity. Europe had a few of these itself, but at the top of the bucket list for Christians who felt like they really needed to show God that they cared about such things was Jerusalem and Bethlehem, birthplace of Christ, way over in the Middle East. So they would walk from Europe all the way over and kneel down and pray at the birthplace of Christ, or walk along I think it's called the Via Dolorosa, the road through Jerusalem, down which Christ carried the cross towards his ultimate crucifixion. So Christian pilgrims would go and walk that route to show that they were really serious about this sort of thing. And that took them out of Europe a little bit and into or exposed them to other influences, Islamic influences. If you were looking at the world in 1000 AD, this is probably what you would guess would be the region most interested in exploring and discovering and colonizing. Islam spread very rapidly, and Islamic areas were very, very interested in trade relations and external connections. You're looking at a map from about 800 AD, all of the gray shaded areas. Here you have the Middle East. Let me recreate quickly with my laser pointer one of those possible pilgrimages. Let's go from London up here all the way down through France and Central Europe, through Turkey, all the way down to, through Turkey, all the way down to Jerusalem right there in the Middle East. But my goodness, the Prophet Muhammad received his visions and died in the early 600s AD. And a mere 150 years later, Islam had spread like wildfire all through the Middle East, all along northern Africa, all the way up into Spain. So it was very, very aggressive. A lot of commercial activity was taking place in that Islamic area. And the Christian pilgrims were among the first to start. Let me think of a better way of saying it. It was those Christian pilgrims who kind of sparked European interest in areas controlled by Islam. So lots of interest in trade and so forth. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly where we're headed, towards the Crusades. Some of those Christian pilgrims who made their way, and that's a serious walk, almost a year of your life, all the way from London to Jerusalem. When they made their way to Jerusalem, they encountered one of the world's great trade routes. They were there for Christian sacred places, but they also discovered that there was a trade network that spanned most of the old world. The Silk Road, one of the most famous trade routes of the ancient world, from China, 2,000 miles all the way to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the end point of that trade route. Some of the world's most valuable products made their way all the way back and forth. If you've ever played that game in the swimming pool, Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road. That's how he got to China. But just for fun, there is an actual image. Some of that road is still around and still used by modern cars and trucks. Those Christian pilgrims coming into or going into Jerusalem and other places in the Middle East encountered the Silk Road and some of those new products, but they also sent back complaints to their relatives, to the Pope, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, about the Islamic forces occupying Jerusalem and other areas in the Middle East. Some of those Christian pilgrims discovered, once they got to Jerusalem, that they were forced to pay admission fees to some of the places they wanted to see, sometimes really expensive admission fees that they didn't have. So there were complaints sent back, and the Pope called for a military campaign for Christian crusaders to travel all the way to Jerusalem and capture those sacred locations so that Christian pilgrims could have access to them. That was one of the main motivations for the Crusades, starting in 1096, and the Crusaders did succeed in capturing Jerusalem in 1096. It's not a story we need to focus on, but it was one heck of a bloody operation, 1096. But for 200 years, European crusaders were in control of various parts of the Middle East. They were mostly interested at the start in religious issues, as I said, but that trade route, once they had control of that trade route, that provided a whole other education that Europeans had not been exposed to extensively prior to that. All kinds of new products they had never encountered. All of those lines you see on the map are different crusades. There were several launched during those 200 years that Europeans were in the Middle East. But once they had Jerusalem, those camel caravans began coming in from the Silk Road, and those new products began tumbling into their laps. And they discovered that they really liked some of those things. They're going to look like luxuries, things that you could do without if you had to. But for the kings and queens, the aristocrats of Europe, a lot of these things quickly became necessities, things that they felt like they had to have. And that led them to begin thinking of different ways of acquiring what they wanted, what they needed, rather than just waiting for the camel caravans. You'll laugh at Dr. Ramsey for doing this, but I keep thinking of different ways of making History 111 exciting for you guys. And what I've done is I've organized some of these products in the form of a late night infomercial. if you stay up late at night and you watch some of those things. What new products, you ask? Silk. The softest fabric known to man at that time. Maybe nowadays they've created something artificially that's even better than silk, but do you know how silk is made? Silkworms, yeah. And China was the only place that knew the secret. My wife and I visited a silkworm factory in Beijing about 20 years ago, and it is elaborate. It's the silkworm. I don't know what it transforms into, but it cocoons itself as part of its transformation. And it's the cocoon that they want. So the Chinese producers, they wait for the silkworm to go through its life cycle, spin the cocoon, and then they extract the little worm before it can transform. And if they do it properly, they can trick the worm into cocooning itself many times before it actually either dies or becomes something beautiful. And once they've got the cocoon, they immerse that in a vat of a special chemical solution, a closely guarded secret. It softens the cocoon, makes the threads more elastic so they can be drawn out into yards of thread and woven into silk thread. Only the Chinese knew how to do it. And that's my main point as we get to some of these other luxurious products. And I'm going to ask you, as part of your exercise today, to think in terms of these categories. So it's something worth remembering for just a brief moment. Things that Europeans desperately wanted, the kings and queens of Europe felt like they had to have this silk fabric once they knew about it, but things they could not make themselves. They certainly wanted to. Only the Chinese knew the secret of how to use silkworms to make silk. So they could either wait for the silk to travel 2,000 miles on the back of a camel, and if we have any business majors in the class, you know, transportation costs get added into the retail value at the end of that journey, that 2,000-mile journey. And then, of course, the Venetian shippers take it to Italy and it gets redistributed. So hand to hand, the product gets marked up and marked up and marked up until it's pretty darned expensive by the time it reaches Western Europe. No surprise, the people most interested in exploring were Portugal and Spain, the ones who paid most once the products got way out there. So beautiful embroideries. The Chinese knew the secret of embroidering that silk in such a way. We don't need to talk about it too much, but if you turn the fabric around, you don't see all the threads and knots. You see another completely finished embroidery on the other side. It boggles the mind how a human being can do such a thing, but the Chinese knew how to do it. And the royalty, the aristocracy of Europe was over the moon for that kind of artistry. Fabulous pearls. I'll really have to rein myself in on this one. I didn't know when I first started dating my wife very much about jewelry. First year we were dating, I thought I had really scored. I bought her a clearance item, opal ring from a clearance sale at a jewelry store, and she patted me on the head. You're so sweet. By the time we got through graduate school, though, I knew the best pearls in the world were Mikimoto. Japanese pearls. H.H. Turner's downtown, Tidwell's Jewelers. You have to be an authorized dealer to sell Mikimoto pearls. There are no authorized Mikimoto dealers in Greenwood, South Carolina. But if you want to show somebody that you really care, or that you've crossed the event horizon, you know, into irrational obsession, a Mikimoto bracelet is the thing. And they only came out of the water around Japan. Still today, the best pearls are brought up by deep sea divers from around the coast of Japan. So Europeans wanted these things, they could not make them themselves. If they wanted a cheaper access to the best pearls available, they had to go to Japan, find a way to go to Japan. And I'll blaze through these. Porcelain. This is a porcelain teapot. Do we have any potters in the class? Or if you've ever seen somebody with one of those wheels throwing, forming the clay up into a pot, you're looking at brown clay. Brown clay. Porcelain is an amorphous white clay. You can't do that. If you pour porcelain onto the wheel, it will spread out like pancake batter. It's not going to work at all. And it's the same story. The Chinese were the only ones who knew how to do it. Europeans discovered porcelain during the Crusades, coming in through the Silk Road, wanted to make it themselves, could not. Now, if you go home for Thanksgiving and your parents bring out the fine china, turn your plate over, dump out all of your food, and look at the back of it, you'll probably see Wedgwood, one of the best porcelain china makers today. Josiah Wedgwood was an Englishman in the 1700s who finally figured out the secret of how to make porcelain. But Europeans were trying. They discovered porcelain during the Crusades, 1200s, did not figure out the secret of how to make it for 500 years. So if they wanted it cheaper than it was coming in over the Silk Road, their only option was go find it, explore, find China, go to China. And of course, what you put into a teapot, the tea. This was, again, a Chinese product. India was producing a fair amount of tea, but China, most of the great tea plantations are still today in China. The British became fiercely devoted to tea. And if they could, they would certainly grow tea in England. It just doesn't grow there. So this is another thing in that category. Things Europeans wanted, and this one's caffeinated. Once you get really hooked on tea, you kind of your body wants the tea. Things Europeans wanted but could not produce themselves, which gave them the impetus to think about exploring, going to the place where it was produced. And what you've got pictured here behind the circular Dr. Ramsay image is cinnamon and nutmeg, but there are a variety of spices coming in along the Silk Road as well. Curry from India. And a lot of these things were absorbed into European cuisine, not only because they made the food taste better or different, but because a lot of them had preservative qualities. Curry, for instance, it's a long, sordid story, but I discovered, and my roommates discovered when I was your age in undergraduate work, that curry, if you don't refrigerate it, you cook it and you don't refrigerate it for several days, it could still be eaten without making you throw up. How did I find it out? Well, I didn't want to ask my parents for more money. So I just tried to make the best of what I had sitting around on the counter. At certain low points in my college career. Mostly I was pretty respectable. But it's a preservative. And in the days before refrigeration, that could be a big benefit. So Europeans wanted this too. It did not grow. It did not grow in Europe. You had to wait for it to come from China or India. Now here's a different category. Changing gears a little bit. Those are products Europeans could not make. Products that made Europeans begin thinking about how to get them more cheaply by going to the supplier. That's where the exploration idea started. These are things they encountered during the Crusades for the first time, which they could make. If you guys are anything like me, you get tired of rowing and rowing and rowing on those sea voyages we all take to get from our dormitory to the cafeteria. You know, if the wind isn't blowing directly where you want to go. This is a Viking ship, but most European ships looked about like this at the start of the Crusades. They all had square sails. A square sail, this hardly needs explanation, I don't think, but a square sail works great if the wind is blowing from behind you to exactly where you want to go. You can sit back and just scoot along the water. But if the wind is blowing right at you, it blows you right back to shore. In such situations, and nature doesn't always cooperate, of course, you have to take down your sail and begin rowing. So all European ships had lots of oars along the sides so that if the wind's not cooperating, you can still go where you want to go and row. Of course, you've always got to stay within sight of some type of landmark on those sea voyages. European ship captains, when they were going on a journey, would buy a logbook of someone who had been over the same route. And they would stay within sight of the coast and they would watch, they would read at a certain number of miles, mountain range, 15 miles further, the mouth of a river. And they would mark their progress to make sure they were where they were supposed to be. And if they got blown away from the side of the coast, they could get really turned around and lost. But during the Crusades, Europeans encountered several new things they had not seen before. I think you can guess what that is. You may have made one yourself in the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts. It's a simple thing to do. A compass, magnetic compass. Europeans had never thought of it before. The Chinese invented it. But once Europeans saw it, they didn't have to wait for it to come from China. And as you know yourself, probably, if you got one of those little merit badges, all you have to do is stick a needle through a cork and rub it on your shirt a little bit, get a little Dixie cup of water, float it in there, and it points north. So once Europeans saw this, they were able to make these compasses themselves. And it gave them the ability to sail into deep waters and still know what direction they were going. So without it, Columbus would have been in big trouble. And just as importantly, there's a replica of one of Columbus's ships. You can see it doesn't have any oars anymore. So European ships evolved as a result of what they saw in the Middle East during the Crusades. There are no more oars at all on this ship. And yes, you do have a square sail in the center, but the real driving engine, if the weather's not cooperating, are those triangular sails. Triangular sails. So they're known as lateen sails. They work like an airplane wing. They create a low pressure front. If the wind is blowing right at you, your square sail is of no use. But if you sail diagonally into the wind, that triangular sail will billow out, create a low pressure front on the front of the sail, and drive the boat forward. It's just like an airplane stays in the air. So you can go zigzag into the wind, tacking back and forth, and go wherever you need to go, no matter what the wind is doing. So you don't have to have all the oars. It requires much less of a crew. You don't have to have all the guys rowing. Much less water, much less food. Those two things all by themselves would have gotten Columbus across the Atlantic Ocean. He could not have done it with 80 guys pulling oars. And same picture again. I'll point at just one other thing. Barely visible there. A rudder. It's not very exciting, but Those old European ships with all the oars didn't have rudders. The only way to turn it was for the captain to tell everybody on the right side to pull and everybody on the left side to push if they wanted to go to the left. With this new innovation, with a rudder, a stern post rudder, it only took one guy steering the ship. So again, much less food and water in order to navigate. Now this next one is an entirely different category. I'll let you decide for yourself where this fits into everything. Same basic story. The Chinese invented it, and it made its way along the Silk Road into the Middle East. Europeans encountered it during the Crusades and immediately began thinking of ways of how to kill people with it. Gunpowder, potassium. Oh, you guys don't need the recipe, do you? Yeah, you want the recipe for gunpowder? I shouldn't have brought it up because I'm not sure I remember. Sulfur, potassium nitrate, and something else. Well, but with those three things, you can cause all kinds of mischief. Yeah. Huh? Charcoal. There you go. So now you're ready for some real agitation. Europeans immediately thought this could be of value for a variety of different enterprises. And it's a little bit behind my image there, but this is one of the very first efforts to weaponize gunpowder by Europeans in the Middle East. They called it a handgun. Handgun. It's basically a tube, an iron tube sealed off at one end. They pack the gunpowder in, put some sharp objects or pebbles in over the gunpowder. They pointed it at the person that was causing them trouble, and it solved all their problems. This little tube you see here is about mid-1300s. Mid-1300s, that's about where Europeans had developed firearms. By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, they had considerably improved on that technology. So they were taking that along as well. And that's an entirely different category. Long and short of all of that is Europeans, as a result of the Crusades, had some things they wanted that they had to go get or wanted to go get. They were far away. China and Japan, India. Spain, there you have it. There's Spain and Portugal. The countries farthest to the west were the ones paying the most, and they were the ones most desperate to find a different way of acquiring those things. So the Portuguese started exploring. Prince Henry the Navigator in the 1420s. They're hoping that they could just sail to the eastward directly to China, but they kept running into Africa. Starting in the 1420s, I better stop this actually and give you your exercise. I'll continue this slide next week, but let me give you an exercise to work on first.